Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Teresa. This is Lost My Thread. I'm very excited to bring you part 2 of my current Clash of the Pattern series. It is the epic wrap dress battle. Now this is part 2 of the series, so if you haven't seen part 1, I would recommend watching that first. I'll put a link to it up here and down in the description box if you haven't seen it already. In part 1 is really just an intro where I'm talking to you about the patterns that I've chosen, the design details of them. I also talk about the fabrics that I'm going to be using for the series. Today is really going to be all about the instructions, so what the level of instruction were like, how clear those things were, the design details, the construction elements, and really how these dresses came together. You will not get full photos of me in these dresses until the final reveal video, but I will just show them to you, and I want to show you some of the more specific design elements. The first one I will tell you guys about is the Wanda wrap dress. So I used this cotton jersey fabric that I got from a destash from So Do It Emma. I really do love this fabric. It's a really wonderful print. Now this one, I will say, it is not exactly what I thought it was. I thought it was a full proper wrap dress, but actually it is a wrap bodice that has just a regular skirt sewn onto it. So it has a big full 6-gourd skirt, really nice big swoosh factor on the bottom, but the top itself is a wrap, so there's a hole for the tie to go through so you can cinch it and make it as tight or as loose as you want to, which I like. I also thought that it was a fully lined bodice. Again, I was wrong. There is a facing on the back here, and it's kind of like a front facing, but it actually gets inserted into this shoulder. Sorry, let me just pull it out from the hanger. This is the front of the bodice piece, this is the sleeve, and then this is the back bodice. So it does get folded over, so the top of it is like it's lined, and then it just becomes a facing that goes into the tie. So it is not exactly as I thought. It's not a lined bodice, it's not a wrap dress, but it's not a million miles off. And I will say, I wish that the pattern was a little bit more clear that that is what you're going for. It mentions that it is a wrap dress, and it mentions a wrap bodice, and it mentions a 6-gourd skirt. And I guess I just assumed that the skirt was a wrap skirt. So sorry guys, I had that wrong. I honestly do blame wardrobe by me. I feel like I should have been a little bit more explicit about that. This one is the Westcliff dress by Friday Pattern Company. I used the African print Lyra Spandex fabric for this one that I got from Diligent Hands Fabrics. Now this one I feel like is even more of a lie. I don't know, they're both probably equally lies. This one, what I thought I was getting was a wrap top bodice, like the other one that I had just mentioned, with a skirt, a regular, just normal skirt attached to it that wasn't a wrap skirt. But actually, it's not even a wrap bodice, it's a faux wrap. So this crossover section is just stitched in place, and there's just a separate tie that you tie around the waist, so it looks like it is a wrap, but it is, honestly, it's no wrap at all. And that honestly did annoy me probably a little bit more. So in their description, they call it a wrap. They say that it wraps around the bodice and then is a skirt. So I knew that the skirt was attached, and I knew that the skirt wasn't a wrap. But when you say that the bodice wraps around you, that implies ties. That means it's supposed to go all the way around you. It's not, it's a crossover front. It's a faux wrap. So not very happy about the fact that it's not a full wrap. Not gonna comment on how it looks because that's a whole nother question, but just to say that that design detail was not as described. And then this one is the Wardrobe by Me Olivia wrap dress in a really gorgeous tencel modal jersey fabric that I got from Guthrie and Ghani. Now the thing that's different about this one, I feel like they're all just like maybe giving me the wrong impressions. Let's just say that. I'm gonna be nice to the pattern companies and say that. I thought that this was a binding that goes around the neckline, but it's actually just a facing that is top stitched down. So this line, it looks like a binding, but it's actually just a stitched facing. So there's nothing particularly pulling that binding in. And that honestly was one of the reasons that drew me to the pattern, but there wasn't anything specific that said that it was a binding. It just really looked like it. And I think with their original pattern design being black fabric, I think it was even harder to tell probably some of those design details. But this one is actually a proper wrap dress, so that's nice. When it came to cutting out the pattern pieces, I had no issue with the Westcliff dress or the Olivia dress. But if I was talking to a friend about what it was like sewing up the Wanda wrap dress and they asked me how it went, I would probably just say, don't ask me about cutting that fabric out, because it was frustrating, it was heartbreaking, it was irritating, it was not a fun time, guys. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. I think the bottom line and the biggest, most important thing is that I just did not have enough fabric. Their fabric requirements were wrong. Definitely not enough. Now, I had 3 meters of 150 wide fabric, which is more than I was supposed to need. They said that I was going to need 2.3 meters for my size. And so I thought, great, I've got extra wiggle room. I am aware that I was using a directional print. So there is a floral print that does have an up and a down. So I knew that, and I thought, okay, well, that could be a factor, but I've got an extra like 0.7 meters. I feel like that really should work. I think what really didn't help is just the general size and shape of the pattern pieces. When I was putting together the gored skirt pieces, they're quite wide and they really don't overlap very well. If I had been able to flip them and then do like, you know, one in one direction, one in the other, I honestly don't even think it still would have worked if I was following the grain lines. So I just went off grain. I made the front and the back correct, but the side sections that were supposed to be on grain, I just angled them, and I decided if the top of the skirt looks like the top of a flower, that's gonna work for me. And I don't think you would ever know the difference. This fabric, it has a fairly decent structure. It's a cotton jersey fabric. It's not super drapey. All the seams went in fine. It doesn't look awkward or it's not hanging weird. So I basically got away with it. But what I didn't get away with was having enough to get all the pieces out. So I realized when I was putting everything out that I just didn't have enough fabric to do the tie. And I was really upset about it. So this fabric, as I mentioned, came from a destash. So I don't even know where it came from. Even if I did, I think this fabric was purchased years ago. So it's probably not going to be available. So there's no way I was going to be able to get a match. So what I decided to do instead was to use a contrasting fabric for the tie belt, because I felt like of all the elements that I'm going to be using a different type of fabric, that will look the most intentional and it will look like a design choice as opposed to looking like a mistake. And so I ended up going for a black fabric. So this is a black base on here on the floral, and I have a black, just a plain black cotton jersey that I used for the tie belt. I think honestly it looks really cool, and I think it does look intentional, and I think it looks good on the dress. Obviously showing a wrap dress just holding it up is never really going to give you the impression, but I'm not too upset about that element. The other thing though that definitely didn't go right, that is upsetting to me, is the front bodice piece. The Wanda wrap dress is the one pattern that didn't have a layout for how you're supposed to cut your fabric out. So not only did I not have enough fabric, I don't know how they think I was supposed to have enough fabric, but also I was a bit confused with how I'm supposed to lay these pattern pieces out. So this is the front bodice piece. When I was looking at the front bodice piece, I was trying to work out really what I was looking at. So this to me looks like the wrap section. This looks like maybe the shoulder. This is part of an armhole, and this is the side seam. And so that was how I laid it out. But if you can see, there's a line that looks like it's kind of at the bias, which is the grain line. So I was like, right, so I got to angle it a bit like this. I did also notice that these pictures, these line drawings of what it's supposed to look like, looked upside down. And I felt like just the whole thing didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me, but I cut it out in the way that I thought it made sense. But guys, I was wrong. This was supposed to be the bottom. So the wrap goes this way. This is the shoulder, this is the armhole, and this is the side seam. Now this shoulder looks massive, but because now I've made the pattern, I know that the shoulder actually folds around, which is what goes into the, like where it catches on the sleeve that I was showing you guys. So as a result of cutting this out, being confused with how I was supposed to lay the pieces out, Guess who cut their bodice pieces upside down? This girl. So I don't think if I saw this dress, I would probably even notice, but I know, and I'm gonna tell you guys, these are upside down. Now, I kind of feel like you can almost tell yourself it's a fairly abstract floral, but maybe there's just flowers like floating and falling down and that's what it looks like. But I mean, really, those are upside down flowers and it is just really disappointing. Obviously, I had no more fabric. There's no way I was going to be able to cut anything else out differently. But if they had given me a layout of how to cut out my fabric, I would never have done that. Even if they had, I just feel like the look of that pattern piece is super confusing, and I wish they'd made it a little bit more clear which was the top and the bottom. So yeah, blaming wardrobe by me for this, though there is a little bit of just personal human error there that I'm not going to discount, but that is my process of cutting this pattern out was not a fun time. As far as the quality of the instructions between all the patterns, the Wanda wrap dress also was definitely the worst of the three. The instructions were very unclear at a lot of the points. All of the patterns had diagrams, which I'm generally a fan of, in addition to written instructions, but there was multiple elements of the Wanda wrap dress that I was looking at those instructions and I could not figure out what they were trying to describe. I don't know if it's the illustrations that were unclear, the words that were unclear, a combination, maybe there should have been more illustrations. One way or another, I really did struggle to understand what some of those steps were. However, they do have a YouTube tutorial or a YouTube sew along that anyone can watch. I'll put a link to it down below. You can watch it. You can see how this dress comes together. When you watch the online sew along, it does make sense, but I just feel like you shouldn't need that element. I feel like you should be able to put a pattern together from the instructions. To me, that is a failing in the instructions. And though I was able to put this together, it was not without a lot of just confusion and headache. The instructions for the Westcliff dress were generally, I will say, really good. So there was enough detail in there that I felt like it was really clear to know what you were doing. Like I said, they had the good instructions, but also a really clear diagram of what you needed to do. They also went above and beyond with a really nice section at the beginning about sewing with knits, which I really appreciate. So if you are a beginner and you haven't sewn with knits before, just a lot of really useful tips and tricks and how to sew with knits effectively and without too many issues. I will say though, just the style of these instructions, they are not for me. This is a personal thing, so I know a lot of you guys probably really love the instructions from Friday Pattern Company, but I just find them really a bit cutesy and obnoxious. So I'm sorry if they're your thing. They're just not my thing, and that's okay. There were a lot of exclamation points, like really a lot of exclamation points, and I have to read one out to you guys because I feel like it gives you the idea of what the instructions are like and what I didn't like about them. So step 11 starts with cool, exclamation point. Look how cute the top of your dress is. 5 exclamation points. Drink it in for a minute and then grab your skirt piece. Right sides together, pin the side seams together. So like personally, I could just skip to the actual instruction on what I need to do. They also have this little, like a button, I'm calling it the button of encouragement, that's there to like tell you you're doing a great job. And I don't know, it felt to me like I'm not a child. I don't need that kind of sticker to tell me I'm doing a good job. I just want to know what the steps are and I want to get on with the steps. But again, personal preference. The instructions are good. That is the bottom line. And the Olivia dress is much more my style of instruction. Very much to the point, not beating around the bush, telling me what I need to do with a really clear description, but then also a really clear diagram so I know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. I will say they also had a section at the beginning that's more just general information and terms and things you need to know when you're using their patterns. And I feel like that was a little bit confusing. It's obviously much more generic. It's not really specific to this pattern. It's not specific to knits. So for example, they had a diagram of showing how to sew a dart, but there aren't any darts in that pattern. And I feel like if you were a beginner, I don't think it's necessarily going to clarify things. I think it might just make things a bit more confusing. But on the whole though, I will say the Olivia dress pattern instructions were my favorite as far as following them along. And I will say that they had the most complicated construction as well of all of them. And still, I was impressed with the details of the instructions. So I think that says a lot. I feel like when you have a simple dress and the instructions are easy to follow, it's not that much of a triumph. But when you have more complicated construction and it's still really clear, you're winning in my books. I also feel like poor attention to detail is always a bit of a red flag for me. I feel like if they have things wrong in the drafting or wrong with the pattern pieces, it doesn't fill me with a whole lot of confidence that the finished garment is going to be that impressive. Sometimes I'm surprised and it is better than I expected, but I will say the Westcliff dress was the one that had most of the alarm bells going off for me that I was not really impressed with. The first one that was just a bit bizarre is when I was first talking about this series, I couldn't figure out whether Westcliff was one word or two words. And that is because it's not even consistent within Friday Pattern Company's information. On their website, it is one word. On the pattern, on the instructions, it is two words. So honestly, guys, like your guess is as good as mine, whether it's supposed to be one word or two words. A bit bizarre that they couldn't figure that out. For one thing, I noticed that the sleeve didn't have any notches at the front and the back of the shoulder. And I thought, oh, well, how am I going to be able to get the front and the back right and make sure it goes in the right way? Until I realized that there are no notches because it's the same. It's a symmetrical piece. So it could be cut on the fold and it wouldn't make a difference. Now I will say in my experience, when you have sleeves that are exactly the same, the curve is exactly the same at the front and the back, they usually sit a little bit oddly on the shoulder. Our shoulders are not the same front to back, which is why you usually have a front and a back piece. So that wasn't very exciting. I wasn't too happy to see that. The other one that was a bit weird is that there was a notch on the inside of the front of the yoke piece. So this here, this is a notch that's supposed to indicate something that you're matching up on the front of the yoke piece. But there was no notches on the binding that's attaching to it. So actually, it's a pointless notch. It's just a notch to match with nothing. So not super impressed. I also noticed when I was putting these pieces together that the seams didn't actually match up. The edges of pattern pieces matched up, but not the seams themselves. So this is the back bodice piece. This is the top of the yoke that's supposed to match onto it. Now it does match up here at the top of the edge of this piece, but the seam allowance is at 5/8. So my seam is going to be significantly below that. And when I open that piece out, it's not going to be smooth. It's going to be janky. And then that needs to go into the binding. I feel like the binding kind of covered up that issue, but it's not impressive drafting. Overall, I was just feeling not super enthusiastic with the way this one came together. Both the Olivia and the Wanda dresses did come together much better. So this is a back-facing piece for the Olivia dress. You can probably even see there's a little bit of a straight edge on either side here, and that is just above the seam allowance, which is 3/8 of an inch on this piece. This is the piece, the facing, that needs to match onto it. And if you actually line them up, you can see that this little straight edge is on both of those pieces so that it lines up really beautifully right along where the seam allowance is. And then when you open it out, it's a really nice smooth curve. That is good pattern drafting. That's what you want to see. And that to me was much more uplifting and made me feel a lot more optimistic about how those two dresses were going to come together. However, when I looked at the Wanda wrap sleeve, I noticed that there was a notch on one side of the sleeve that should be matching a notch on the other side of the sleeve, but it's only on one side. Why are you going to have a notch on one side that's supposed to match up with the other side when there's nothing to match it with? You need notches both sides or there is no point of any notches. So my confidence went down a little bit for the Wanda wrap dress, and I felt like, if they're letting this sneak by, what does that mean about the rest of this dress? As far as the finish on these, I think my favorite one, honestly, is the Wanda wrap dress. So like I said, it's got this really nice back facing, and then it has this enclosed seam here where the bodice folds over to create this facing. I really do like that edge. And then also the ties were really interesting to put together. I am a sucker for an unusual construction, especially one that comes together really neatly. It's really difficult to show you guys this. I did actually film to try and demonstrate, but I know I'm working with black fabric, so it's not always that easy. The tie itself has this really beautiful angle to it. This is the front of it, and the back actually has a seam going down the center. I think you can probably see that there. So you have a really bizarre looking pattern piece when you're cutting it out, but trust the process. When I see a weird looking pattern piece, I trust the process. You create a tube of fabric like that looks just really bizarre, but then the way it folds over when you're sewing along this line, you're able to create this really nice middle seam. So when you turn it inside out, it looks absolutely beautiful. And I love that that seam is sitting flat against your body, and that continues up right the way, including onto the bodice piece itself. And I feel like it just helps then to bring that facing inward. This facing is never gonna flip out. The way that it is just anchored at the top and it's twisted in down at the end of that tie or the beginning of that tie, it always turns in a really nice way without needing any top stitching. I think it is really clever. I think it is really beautiful. I was looking at the pattern designer and they've described they actually have had many years of working in the fashion industry for ready-to-wear clothes. And one of the things that they try to do is create a ready-to-wear finish. And I feel like this is actually a really good example of it comes together really beautifully well, and I was super impressed with the finish on it. The Olivia dress definitely had the most complicated construction. I feel like some of it probably more complicated than it needed to be. I know they had their reasons, but I didn't necessarily love all the work that went into making this one. This was definitely the most time-consuming one because there were just a lot of steps. I think it's a more complicated dress in general. It has pockets for a start, which is definitely a really positive thing. I'm always gonna love pockets. But I will say the pocket piece itself is actually, it's not a great pocket. It's a very shallow pocket. And I know that when I have a pocket like this, especially if it's like a knit and jersey, if I put, say, my phone into that pocket, it's just gonna be popping out all the time. So I did actually extend the bottom of this pocket bag to make it a better pocket for me. And I did also make a bit of a boo-boo. I was obviously in a bit of a like half with it headspace when I was cutting some of these pattern pieces out. But you know, when you're making pockets, you need to have 4 pieces cut out for 2 pockets. So 1 or 2 per pocket. I only cut out 1 layer of pocket. I think because I was extending the pocket bag, that also meant that I didn't have quite enough fabric to get all 4 pocket pieces out of it. It didn't make a difference because I actually had some other fabric that I was able to use. I just used a viscose jersey fabric that it doesn't really pop too much against it. This is the front side of the pocket, and they do have a really nice construction of the pocket where they get you to understitch, top stitch this down, and then you actually sew a little bit into the edge of this pocket to make sure that it really stays shut. So it's not going to gape open, and I really do appreciate that, especially because I was using a contrasting pocket bag. At the shoulder seams, they actually do tell you to use some stay tape. It's not optional. They tell you to use stay tape. I find stay tape actually a bit scratchy. I don't really like it, so I just use some plain ribbon instead, and I think that works well. It does stabilize the shoulder. This is a heavier fabric, so I felt like it really did want to have it. The waist as well actually has elastic in it, which I didn't realize. I'm not quite sure that it makes a huge difference, to be completely honest with you, because I'm actually tying it with a wrap. So I don't know if it actually is obvious that I have that there, but maybe it helps a little bit with the shaping. Putting it together though, I will say was a bit awkward. So you have a thin layer of elastic that you're going to be pulling so that it's, well, till the fabric is taut. You have elastic, then the back of the skirt, and then the bottom of the bodice, and all of that is supposed to go through the serger together. So this one, they do generally say to do most of your stitches on the serger. They do specify to do that, or overlocker, which I did, but you're supposed to somehow have this in there. This is a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. You needed to just trim off a little bit of the edge there, but make sure you weren't trimming the elastic itself. It was a really odd and fiddly thing to do whilst you're putting it through the serger. This one also has some pleats here. So there's pleats at the front of one of the panels of the skirt, which is a nice detail, but it was just another thing to try and keep straight as you're putting it all through the serger at once. And I did actually miss one bit of it. It didn't actually catch, and I had to go back and just zigzag over the edge because the bodice and the skirt weren't actually attached. I just feel like it was a super fiddly process, and I feel like, I don't know, they could have used a channel. They could have used a different method to get that elastic in there if they wanted it. Or honestly, they could have just not bothered having the elastic, and I don't think it really would have made a huge difference. One thing they did add that was optional was to put some knit interfacing on some of the areas. And again, like this fabric is a little bit heavier. I felt like I wanted to make sure that everything was going to stay in place. So they tell you that you can add knit interfacing both where the tie is going to go through, just to give a bit more security, but you can also add it to where the pockets are going to attach, which I appreciate. I feel like things are less likely to bounce around as much, but they didn't give you a separate pattern piece for that. This is one of the skirt panels just to show you what I'm talking about. So this is where the pocket opening is from here to here. And what you're supposed to do is to get a little interfacing strip to go along that edge. Now, if it was a straight edge, I wouldn't mind just cutting some strips out. But as you can see, there is a curve to this. So I had to somehow cut along the curve, shift the piece over on the interfacing, and then cut another piece along the same curve to be able to get something that's going to mimic the shape of the skirt. This was on both of the front bodice pieces and the back bodice pieces, in addition to those little sections where the tie comes through at the bodice. I also had to interface the tie itself and the facing pieces. I feel like I spent a lot of my life, too much of my life, both cutting out those pieces, but then fusing all that interfacing. By the time I finished it, I was already feeling a little bit fed up. Yes, I know it's going to create a really nice garment in the end, but man, it was tedious. The Westcliff dress though, it never in the whole instructions mentions a serger or an overlocker. It just talks about sewing it on your regular sewing machine. So I decided to just go with that. I mean, like I said, you can make these dresses on a regular sewing machine, but I will say I don't love the finish as much. So I didn't bother zigzagging anything at the end. I just did my regular zigzag stitch. It works well and it looks fine on the outside. I prefer the neater finish that I get when I use my serger, and it's just a bit of a downside to me that if you follow the instructions, I just don't think it's going to be as neat as the other ones. Thinking about the process from beginning to end, from what it was like to cut these out, put these together, and the finish that I get at the final garment, clearly none of these were perfect. They all had their flaws and elements that I didn't like. The Wanda wrap dress was definitely the most frustrating as far as cutting it out and sewing it up. The finish though is absolutely beautiful. The Westcliff dress on the whole, I will say, came together pretty well, but there were some definite issues with how this garment is drafted. The Olivia dress was really nice and came together with a beautiful finish, but it was really tedious and I feel like overly complicated more than it needed to be. Looking at my leaderboard and where everything is sitting right now, I have to put the Wanda wrap dress by Wardrobe by Me down in third place. Like I said, there was just too much frustrating me about putting that one together. The Westcliff dress by Friday Pattern Company is going to be sitting in second place because it really just had too many flaws, honestly. The Olivia wrap dress by Named Clothing, yes, it was tedious to put together. Yes, it was more complicated than it probably needed to be, but it's a beautiful finish. It did come together really well. It's okay sometimes for things to be a little bit more complicated, to take your time if you're going to get a nice garment at the end of it. So the Olivia wrap dress is sitting right at the top for me right now. None of this means that any of these are going to be the winner or the loser in the end. The next time I come back with a Clash of the Patterns video, I'm going to be talking to you about the fit of these garments. So I'll have some close-up shots and talk through how these fit on my body, how happy I am with how these came together, how I picked my size, and then I will be doing the final reveal. You get to see the full dresses on me, where I will talk about the styling, how the dress looks, how it feels, and which one is my favorite at the end. Please do give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video today. Make sure you are subscribed to my channel if you want to see more Clash of the Patterns or other videos from me, and I hope to see you very soon. Bye!